words cut through the glittering ballroom like a blade through silk. Still unwed at 30? Lady Caroline Ashworth felt every eye in the room turn toward her. The Christmas ball at Thornfield Manor, the most anticipated event of the 1818 holiday season, fell into that particular quality of silence that precedes social devastation. Lady Constance Pemberton stood before her, resplendent in ruby silk, her smile as sharp as cut glass. Behind her, a circle of London's most influential ladies waited with predatory interest. "My dear Caroline," Constance continued, her voice carrying across the ballroom with deliberate clarity, "surely you must have some prospects by now, or have you quite given up hope of matrimony altogether?" Caroline's fingers tightened on her champagne glass. "I am 30 years old, unmarried, the daughter of a baron whose modest estate could barely maintain appearances. She had endured 7 seasons of diminishing prospects, watched younger women marry and bear children, and felt herself becoming invisible with each passing year. But what none of them knew, what no one in this ballroom knew, was that 6 months ago, everything had changed." "Lady Constance," Caroline said quietly, her voice steady despite the mortification burning through her chest, "my marital status is hardly appropriate dinner conversation." "Oh, but Caroline," another voice chimed in, Lady Victoria Hastings stepping forward with false sympathy. "We only worry for you. At your age, without prospects, what will become of you?" The laughter was subtle, refined, devastating. Caroline felt the familiar sting of tears threatening, the old shame rising. She had been here before, dismissed, pitied, reduced to society's cautionary tale. But this time was different. This time, she wore a simple gold band hidden beneath her glove. This time, she carried a secret that would shatter every assumption in this room. She opened her mouth to respond. "I believe," a deep voice resonated through the ballroom, sending a ripple of shock through the assembled guests. "You are addressing my wife." Every head turned. And there, standing in the doorway like a vengeance incarnate, was Alexander Blackwood, the Duke of Ravensmere, the most powerful, wealthy, and notoriously reclusive peer in all of England. The silence that followed was absolute. 6 months earlier, April 1818. Caroline Ashworth had long since accepted her fate. At 29 years old, she was what society whispered about but never quite said aloud, a spinster. Not that the word was ever used directly, the tongue was far too polite for such crude terminology. Instead, they employed gentler cruelties. "Still attending the season, Lady Caroline? How persistent of you. My dear, have you considered that perhaps matrimony simply isn't your calling? Some ladies are meant for marriage, others, well, they serve different purposes." Caroline had endured it all with the grace her mother had taught her, the dignity her father insisted upon, and the quiet desperation that kept her awake at night wondering what, exactly, would become of her. Her father's estate in Cornwall was failing. Not dramatically, the Ashworths were too proud for dramatic failures, but steadily, inevitably, like a ship taking on water, one bucket at a time. The roof needed repairs they couldn't afford. The tenant cottages were crumbling. Her younger brother Thomas would inherit debts, not prosperity, and Caroline, unwed and unmarriageable, would become a burden. She had watched her prospects dwindle year by year. At 18, fresh from the schoolroom, she had received modest attention, a second son here, a country gentleman there. At 22, the attention had cooled. At 25, it had evaporated entirely. Now, approaching 30, she was invisible. She attended society events out of obligation and habit, a ghost haunting ballrooms where she no longer belonged. She danced when asked rarely, and smiled when expected, and went home each night to her small room in her father's London townhouse, feeling the weight of her failure pressing down upon her chest. "You could accept Mr. Weatherby," her mother had suggested gently that April morning, as Caroline prepared to attend yet another tedious afternoon tea. "He is respectable, kind, even." Mr. Weatherby was 63, a widower with 5 grown children and a tendency to fall asleep mid-conversation. He had proposed 3 times, each offer coming with the subtle implication that Caroline should be grateful for any attention at all. "I would rather remain unwed," Caroline had replied quietly. "But, darling," her mother's eyes had filled with concern, "what will you do? When your father is gone, when Thomas inherits, You cannot expect to remain in the family home indefinitely. Thomas will marry, eventually, and his wife. I will not want a spinster aunt underfoot, Caroline finished. Yes, mother, I understand. She understood perfectly. She would become the poor relation, shuttled between family members who pitied her, useful only for minding children or managing households that weren't her own. It was this bleak future that had driven her to the bookshop that fateful April afternoon. She had been seeking escape in novels, stories where plain, overlooked women somehow found happiness when she had quite literally collided with him. "Forgive me," she had gasped as books tumbled from her arms. "I wasn't watching where—" "The fault was mine," a deep voice replied. Caroline had looked up into the coldest, most striking face she had ever seen. The man was tall, imposingly so, with dark hair that fell slightly too long to be fashionable, and eyes of such pale grey they seemed almost silver. His features were harsh, all sharp angles and stern lines, and he carried himself with the rigid bearing of a man who had long ago forgotten how to smile. He was also, she realized with a jolt of recognition, one of the most powerful men in England, Alexander Blackwood, the Duke of Ravensmere. "Your Grace," Caroline had stammered, executing an awkward curtsy while clutching her fallen books. "I apologize for my clumsiness." "You need not apologize," he had interrupted, his voice formal but not unkind. He bent to retrieve a volume that had slid beneath a shelf. "Ah, Mrs. Radcliffe. You have excellent taste in literature, miss." "Lady Caroline Ashworth," she had supplied, accepting the book with trembling fingers. "And yes, I confess a weakness for Gothic novels. They are far more interesting than reality." Something had flickered across his stern features, amusement, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. "Indeed," he had agreed, "reality is often disappointing." They had stood there in the dusty bookshop, two people who didn't quite fit in the glittering world they inhabited, and for just a moment, Caroline had felt seen. "Do you attend many society events, Lady Caroline?" the Duke had asked, an odd intensity in his pale eyes. "As few as possible, Your Grace," Caroline had admitted before she could censor herself. "I find them rather exhausting." "As do I," he had replied. Then, with careful deliberation, "Lady Caroline, I wonder if I might call upon you. There is a matter I would like to discuss. A proposition, if you will." Caroline's heart had stuttered. Surely he didn't mean a business proposition, he had clarified quickly. "Nothing improper. But I believe we might be of mutual benefit to one another." And so, 3 days later, Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Ravensmere, had sat in her father's drawing-room and made the most extraordinary proposal Caroline had ever received. "Lady Caroline," the Duke had begun without preamble, his pale grey eyes fixed on her face with unsettling intensity. "I shall be direct, as I have no talent for pretty speeches. I find myself in need of a wife." Caroline's teacup had rattled against its saucer. Across the room, her mother had made a small, strangled sound. "However," the Duke had continued, "I do not require a love match. I do not seek romantic entanglement or emotional intimacy. What I require is a solution to a practical problem, and I believe you might be that solution." It was, Caroline would reflect later, possibly the least romantic proposal in the history of matrimony. "Your Grace," she had managed, "I'm afraid I don't understand." "Let me be plain," Alexander had said, leaning forward slightly. "I am 35 years old. I have been Duke since my father's death when I was 22. For 13 years, I have managed extensive estates, significant investments, and considerable political influence. I have also, for 13 years, endured relentless pressure to marry and produce an heir." He had paused, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "I was engaged once, 8 years ago, Lady Margaret Thornfield. She was beautiful, accomplished, and entirely suitable. 3 weeks before our wedding, I discovered her in a rather compromising position with my closest friend, Lord Edmund Carey. The engagement was dissolved. The scandal was significant." Caroline's heart had clenched with unexpected sympathy, so the Duke, too, carried wounds. "Since then," Alexander had continued, his voice carefully controlled, "I have avoided society whenever possible. I have rejected every attempt at matchmaking. I have made it abundantly clear that I have no interest in matrimony. Unfortunately, this has only intensified the pressure." "Your family wishes you to marry," Caroline had said softly. "My mother," Alexander had corrected with barely suppressed frustration, has made it her life's mission to see me wed. She invites eligible ladies to my estates without warning. She orchestrates accidental meetings in London. She has made my life unbearable with her interference. He had stood then, moving to the window with controlled agitation. 3 months ago she issued an ultimatum. If I do not marry by Christmas, she will select a bride for me herself. She has identified Lady Constance Pemberton as the ideal candidate, a woman of impeccable breeding, substantial dowry, and absolutely no personality whatsoever. Despite herself, Caroline had felt her lips twitch. Lady Constance was indeed everything the Duke described, perfectly polished, utterly conventional, and about as warm as a marble statue. I will not, Alexander had said, turning back to face her, marry Lady Constance. I will not marry any woman selected by my mother. But I also cannot continue to fight this battle alone. I need, he had paused, seeming to struggle with the admission, I need a wife who will ask nothing of me emotionally, a wife who understands this is a practical arrangement, not a romantic fairy tale, a wife who will be content with respect, financial security, and freedom to pursue her own interests within the bounds of propriety. The words had hung in the air between them. And you believe I am such a woman, Caroline had said quietly. I believe, Alexander had replied, his pale eyes meeting hers with uncomfortable honesty, that you are a woman of intelligence who finds herself in difficult circumstances. Your father's financial situation is not unknown to me, Lady Caroline. I understand you face limited prospects and an uncertain future. Caroline had felt heat flood her cheeks, mortification mixed with reluctant admiration for his directness. You are offering me a marriage of convenience, she had stated. I am offering you security, Alexander had corrected. A position of significant social standing, financial independence, freedom from the uncertainty that currently defines your situation. In return, I ask only that you fulfill the basic duties of a duchess, attend necessary social functions, manage my households, and eventually, when we are both comfortable with the arrangement, provide an heir. He had moved closer, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. I also offer you honesty, Lady Caroline. I will never pretend affection I do not feel. I will never offer you romantic love or passionate devotion, but I will treat you with respect. I will ensure your comfort and safety, and I will never, ever humiliate you, as Lady Margaret humiliated me. Caroline had sat in stunned silence, her mind racing. It was everything she hadn't known she wanted: security, position, respect, freedom from the pitying glances and whispered comments, an end to her father's financial worries, a future that didn't involve becoming a burden to her brother's eventual wife, but no love, no warmth, no hope of the partnership she had once, in her naive youth, dreamed of finding. Why me? She had asked finally. Surely there are other women who would accept such terms, younger women, more beautiful women. Alexander had studied her for a long moment before responding. Because when I collided with you in that bookshop, Lady Caroline, you looked at me as though I was simply a man who had dropped your books, not a duke, not a prize to be won, just a person. It has been 8 years since anyone has looked at me that way. The honesty in his words had stolen her breath. And because, he had continued, you read Mrs. Radcliffe and admitted you prefer fiction to reality. You are intelligent enough to be interesting, practical enough to understand what I offer, and from what I have observed, kind enough not to make this arrangement more difficult than it needs to be. You have been observing me? Caroline had asked, surprised. I made inquiries after our meeting, Alexander had admitted without shame. You are considered somewhat odd by society, too bookish, too opinionated, too willing to discuss topics ladies should avoid. You are thought to have aged out of marriageability. These qualities, which society deems flaws, are precisely what I require. It should have been insulting. Instead, Caroline had found it strangely liberating. And the arrangement would be? She had prompted. We would marry quickly and quietly, Alexander had said. Immediately, in fact. I have already procured a special license. We would keep the marriage secret for 6 months, allowing you time to adjust to your new position without society's scrutiny. During this time, you would travel to my various estates, learning your duties as Duchess. Why keep it secret? Caroline had asked. Because, Alexander had replied, Society expects me to marry someone like Lady Constance. When I instead present them with a wife I have chosen myself, a woman of modest circumstances and advancing age, as they would describe it, the shock will be considerable. Better to present them with a fait accompli than to endure months of speculation and interference. Caroline had absorbed this, turning the proposal over in her mind. "And if I accept," she had said slowly, "what exactly would our marriage entail? You mentioned providing an heir eventually. Does that mean?" "We would maintain separate chambers," Alexander had said, his expression carefully neutral. "I would not impose upon you unless and until we had reached a mutual understanding. This is not a marriage of passion, Lady Caroline. It is a partnership of convenience." "A business arrangement," Caroline had supplied. "Precisely." Caroline had looked at her mother, who sat pale and silent, clearly torn between horror at the unconventional proposal and relief at the solution to their family's financial crisis. Then she had looked at the Duke, this stern, wounded man, who offered her everything except the one thing she had long ago stopped believing she deserved. "Very well," Caroline had said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I accept your proposal, Your Grace. When would you like to marry?" Alexander's expression had shifted relief, perhaps, or satisfaction. "Tomorrow," he replied. "We will marry tomorrow." They had married the next day in a small church in Hampshire, with only the vicar and 2 servants as witnesses. Caroline had worn a simple day dress of pale blue. Alexander had been formally correct in charcoal grey. They had spoken their vows in steady voices, exchanged plain gold bands, and shared the briefest, most chaste kiss Caroline had ever experienced. "Well then, Duchess," Alexander had said as they emerged into the spring sunshine, "shall we begin?" The first month had been peculiar. Alexander had taken Caroline to Ravensmere Abbey, his principal estate in Northumberland. The house was magnificent, a sprawling Elizabethan manor surrounded by wild moors and ancient forests. It was also cold, formal, and staffed by servants who regarded their new duchess with barely concealed confusion. "The Duke has never brought a lady here," Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper, had confided in a whisper. "Not since, well, not in 8 years." Caroline had thrown herself into learning her duties. She toured the estate with Alexander, learning about tenant management, crop rotations, and the complex web of responsibilities that came with such extensive holdings. She met with Mrs. Henderson daily, reviewing household accounts and establishing her authority over domestic matters. And every evening, she and Alexander had dinner together. It was these dinners that first began to shift something between them. Initially, they had been stiffly formal affairs. Alexander would discuss estate business. Caroline would respond with appropriate interest. They would eat in relative silence, then retire to separate wings of the house. But gradually, carefully, they began to talk about other things. It started with books. "You mentioned enjoying Mrs. Radcliffe," Alexander had said one evening, perhaps 3 weeks into their marriage. "Have you read her latest?" "I have not," Caroline had admitted. "Gothic novels are rather frowned upon. My mother considers them unsuitable reading for ladies. My library has an entire section dedicated to such unsuitable literature," Alexander had replied, something that might have been amusement flickering across his stern features. "You are welcome to explore it." The next morning, Caroline had discovered that Alexander's library was extraordinary. 3 stories of floor-to-ceiling shelves containing everything from classical philosophy to scandalous French novels. She had been examining a particularly intriguing volume when Alexander had entered. "Voltaire," he had observed, noting her selection. "My father would have been horrified. He believed ladies should confine their reading to conduct books and devotional texts." "And what do you believe?" Caroline had asked. Alexander had moved closer, his pale grey eyes thoughtful. "I believe that limiting a person's access to knowledge because of their sex is both illogical and wasteful. Intelligence is rare enough without artificially constraining half the population." Caroline had felt something warm unfurl in her chest, the beginning of genuine respect. "You are unusual, Your Grace," she had said softly. "Alexander," he had corrected. "When we are private, you should call me Alexander. We are married, after all. Then you must call me Caroline." That evening, their dinner conversation ranged from philosophy to politics to the economics of sheep farming. Caroline had discovered that Alexander possessed a dry wit that emerged when he felt comfortable, and that beneath his stern exterior lay a formidable intellect and unexpected kindness. "You are not what I expected," Caroline had admitted as the evening drew to a close. "Nor are you," Alexander had replied. "I expected a woman grateful for rescue. Instead, I find myself married to someone who debates the merits of crop rotation with genuine enthusiasm and corrects my interpretation of Rousseau." "Are you displeased?" Caroline had asked, suddenly uncertain. "On the contrary," Alexander had said, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "I am pleasantly surprised." The second month brought more surprises. They had travelled to Alexander's Scottish estate, a forbidding castle perched on cliffs overlooking the North Sea. Caroline had expected to find it as cold and formal as Ravensmere Abbey. Instead, she had discovered a place that Alexander clearly loved. "My mother was Scottish," he had explained as they walked the wind-swept battlements. "This was her family's castle. I spent my childhood summers here, running wild on the moors. It is," he had paused, seeming to struggle with the admission, "it is the only place I have ever felt truly at home." That he had brought her here, to this place of personal significance, had touched Caroline more deeply than she could express. They had spent weeks at the Scottish castle, and Caroline had watched Alexander transform. Away from English society and its expectations, his stern mask had cracked. He smiled more readily. He laughed actual laughter at her wry observations about the castle's resident flock of sheep, who seemed determined to escape their pasture daily. One afternoon, caught in a sudden rainstorm while walking the cliffs, they had run for shelter, arriving at the castle drenched and breathless. "You look like a drowned cat," Alexander had said, and then, seeing Caroline's expression, had burst into genuine laughter. "And you," Caroline had retorted, pulling a soggy leaf from his dark hair, "look like a disreputable brigand." They had stood there in the castle's entrance hall, dripping water onto ancient stone, grinning at each other like children. And something had shifted. Alexander's laughter had faded, replaced by an intensity that made Caroline's breath catch. His hand had lifted, almost unconsciously, to brush a wet strand of hair from her face. "Caroline," he had murmured, his voice rough. The moment had stretched, charged with possibility. Then Alexander had stepped back, his expression closing. "You should change," he had said formally. "You'll catch your death in those wet clothes." Caroline had felt the loss of that almost moment, like a physical ache. The third month had brought the London season and their return to Ravensmere Abbey. "We should begin attending some events," Alexander had said one morning over breakfast. "Nothing too grand yet. Small dinners, the theatre. We must begin establishing your presence in society before we reveal our marriage." "You want to be seen with me publicly before announcing I'm your wife," Caroline had translated. "I want society to become accustomed to seeing us together," Alexander had corrected, "so that when we do reveal the marriage, it seems a natural progression rather than a shocking surprise." And so they had begun appearing together. To society, it must have seemed odd the reclusive Duke of Ravensmere suddenly attending events with Lady Caroline Ashworth, spinster daughter of an impoverished baron. But Alexander had been unfailingly attentive. He had ensured Caroline always had refreshments. He had partnered her in dances. He had engaged her in conversations that made her laugh. "People are staring," Caroline had whispered at the theatre one evening. "Let them stare," Alexander had replied, his hand covering hers on the armrest. "You are he had stopped himself. "You are with me. Their opinions are irrelevant." But he had been about to say, "my wife," Caroline had realized, and the fact that he couldn't, that they had to maintain this pretense, had begun to chafe. The fourth month had brought the first real argument. "Lady Constance has invited us to a house party in the Lake District," Alexander had announced over dinner. "Us?" Caroline had asked carefully. "Well, she invited me," Alexander had admitted. "But I informed her I would only attend if you were included in the invitation." She could hardly refuse. "Alexander," Caroline had set down her fork, "why would you want to attend a house party hosted by the woman your mother wishes you to marry?" "Because," Alexander had replied, his jaw tightening, "my mother will be there, and it is time to begin hinting that my affections are otherwise engaged." "Your affections," Caroline had repeated, something bitter rising in her throat. "How convenient that you can pretend affection when it suits your purposes." Alexander had stared at her, surprise flickering across his features. "Caroline." "Forgive me," Caroline had interrupted, standing abruptly. "I find I have lost my appetite. Good evening, Your Grace." She had fled to her chambers, angry at herself for caring, for wanting something he had explicitly told her he could not give. But Alexander had followed. His knock had come 20 minutes later, quiet but insistent. "Caroline," he had called through the door. "Please, I wish to speak with you." She had opened the door to find him looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "I upset you," he had said. "That was not my intention." "Your intention," Caroline had replied, struggling to keep her voice steady, "is to use me as a shield against your mother's matchmaking. I understood that from the beginning. What I did not understand is how difficult it would become to pretend our marriage is merely a business arrangement when I—" She had stopped herself, horrified. "When you what?" Alexander had prompted, stepping into her room uninvited, his pale eyes intense. "When I have come to care for you," Caroline had admitted in a whisper, "as more than a business partner, as a friend, at least, perhaps as something more." The silence had been devastating. Then Alexander had closed the distance between them, his hands framing her face with unexpected tenderness. "Caroline," he had breathed, his forehead touching hers, "do you truly believe this is still merely business for me? Do you think I would have brought you to my Scottish castle, shared my mother's memory, laughed with you, sought your company constantly, if you were simply a convenient solution to my problems?" Caroline's heart had been hammering so hard she could barely hear her own thoughts. "But you said—" "I said I could not offer you romantic love," Alexander had interrupted, "because 8 years ago I learned that such feelings lead only to betrayal and pain. But you—" he had pulled back slightly, his eyes searching hers, "you have made me question everything I believed I knew about myself. You have made me want things I swore I would never risk again." "What things?" Caroline had whispered. "You," Alexander had replied simply. "Not as a wife of convenience. As my wife, my partner, my—" he had seemed to struggle with the word. "My love," he had finally said, the admission clearly costing him. "I am falling in love with you, Caroline. Perhaps I have been since the bookshop, and it terrifies me." Caroline had felt tears slip down her cheeks. "I love you too," she confessed. "I have tried not to. I told myself I was foolish to hope, but I cannot help it. Alexander, I love you." The kiss, when it came, had been nothing like their chaste wedding kiss. It had been passionate, desperate, years of loneliness and fear, finally surrendering to the terrifying possibility of happiness. "Stay with me tonight," Alexander had murmured against her lips. "Not out of duty, not eventually. Now, because I cannot bear to spend another night alone when you are so close." Caroline had answered by pulling him closer. What had followed had been tender and awkward and perfect. They had learned each other slowly, carefully, two wounded souls daring to trust again. And afterward, lying tangled together in the darkness, Alexander had pressed a kiss to her temple. "I need to tell you something," he had said quietly, "about Lady Margaret, about why her betrayal wounded me so deeply." Caroline had waited, sensing this was important. "I loved her," Alexander had admitted. "Truly, I desperately loved her, or so I believed. When I discovered her with Edmund, it wasn't just the betrayal that destroyed me. It was the realization that I had been so blinded by what I wanted to see that I had missed every warning sign." He had been silent for a moment. "She never loved me, Caroline. She loved my title, my wealth, my position. I was merely the means to an end, and I had been too foolish to recognize it." "I am not her," Caroline had said softly. "I know," Alexander had replied. "You are everything she was not, honest, kind, genuine. You chose to marry me knowing I could offer you no romance. You asked for nothing beyond basic respect, and somehow, without trying, you gave me everything I thought I had lost forever." "What did I give you?" Caroline had asked. "Hope," Alexander had whispered. "You gave me hope." The months that followed had been transformative. They had stopped maintaining separate chambers. They had stopped pretending their marriage was merely practical. They had fallen deeply, irrevocably in love. But they had also maintained the secret. Just until Christmas, Alexander had insisted, "Let us have these months to ourselves, without society's scrutiny. Then, at the Thornfield Christmas ball, we shall announce our marriage properly. Let them gossip all they wish by then. We will be so obviously devoted that no one will question whether our marriage is genuine." Caroline had agreed, treasuring these private months where they could simply be Alexander and Caroline, husband and wife, without the weight of their respective positions. But as Christmas approached and the Thornfield ball loomed, Caroline had begun to feel a growing unease. "What if society reacts badly?" she had asked one evening. "What if they mock you for choosing someone like me?" Alexander had pulled her close, his arms a shelter against all worry. "Let them mock," he had said fiercely. "You are my wife, my duchess, the woman I love beyond all reason. Anyone who fails to see your value is beneath my concern." But Caroline knew society's cruelty firsthand, and she feared that the Thornfield Christmas ball would test them both in ways neither had anticipated. The Thornfield Manor Christmas ball was, as always, the pinnacle of the holiday season. Every person of consequence attended. The ballroom dripped with evergreen garlands and winter roses. An orchestra played from a balcony decorated with ribbons and bells. Tables groaned under the weight of elaborate refreshments. Candlelight transformed the space into something magical. And Caroline, dressed in a gown of deep emerald silk that Alexander had commissioned specifically for this evening, felt her stomach churn with anxiety. "Are you certain about this?" she had asked in the carriage. "Absolutely certain," Alexander had replied, raising her gloved hand to his lips. "Tonight, the pretense ends. Tonight, I claim you as my wife before all of society, and I shall enjoy every moment of their shock." They had agreed to arrive separately, one final piece of theatre. Alexander would come early. Caroline would arrive later, giving him time to circulate and remind society of his presence before the revelation. Caroline had arrived at 9 o'clock, her father's modest carriage pulling up behind far grander conveyances. She had ascended the steps alone, given her name to the butler, and entered the glittering ballroom with her head held high, despite the familiar anxiety coiling in her chest. She was 30 years old, unmarried, as far as anyone knew, the spinster daughter of an impoverished baron. She no longer belonged in spaces like this, but she had come anyway, bolstered by the memory of Alexander's words that morning. "You are a duchess. You belong anywhere you choose to be. Remember that." Caroline had scanned the crowd, looking for her husband's dark head, when she had been intercepted. Lady Caroline, Lady Victoria Hastings, had appeared with several other ladies in tow, their smiles sharp. "How unexpected to see you here. I thought you had quite given up on society events." "I attend when the occasion warrants," Caroline had replied evenly. "Indeed," Lady Victoria's eyes glittered with malice, "though I confess, I cannot imagine what occasion would warrant your presence at the season's most elegant ball." Before Caroline could respond, another voice had joined them. Lady Caroline Ashworth. Lady Constance Pemberton had materialized like an avenging angel, resplendent in ruby silk, her blonde hair arranged in elaborate curls. "Still attending these events, I see," Constance had said, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "How admirable of you. Such persistence in the face of, well, reality." Caroline had felt her cheeks flame, but kept her voice steady. "I was invited, Lady Constance, just as you were." "Oh, but darling." Constance had moved closer, her voice lowering to carry just far enough to be heard by the gathering crowd. "Invitations are distributed rather broadly, are they not? It doesn't necessarily mean one truly belongs." Several ladies had tittered behind their fans. Caroline had scanned the room desperately, looking for Alexander. Where was he? "Tell me, Caroline," Constance had continued, using her Christian name without permission, a subtle insult. "Do you have any prospects this season? Any gentlemen calling? Or have you, perhaps, finally accepted reality?" "I'm not sure I take your meaning," Caroline had replied, though she knew exactly what was coming. "Well, my dear," Constance's smile had been poisonous, "you are 30 years old. Surely you must recognize that your time has passed. There is no shame in it. Some ladies are simply not meant for matrimony. They serve their purposes in other ways." Lady Victoria had leaned in conspiratorially. "Perhaps you might consider accepting a position as a companion. Lady Ashworth, you know, is quite elderly and in need of someone to read to her. It would be respectable employment and far more suitable than continuing to attend balls where you so clearly no longer fit." The words had landed like physical blows. Employment. They were suggesting she seek employment. Caroline had felt the familiar shame rising, the same shame she had carried for years, the crushing weight of society's judgment, the knowledge that she was invisible, unwanted, an embarrassment to be pitied and dismissed. Still unwed at 30, Constance's voice had cut through the ballroom, loud enough now to capture widespread attention. Conversations had faltered, heads had turned. A circle had formed around them, curious and cruel. "My dear Caroline," Constance had continued, her voice carrying across the increasingly quiet space, "surely you must have some prospects by now, or have you quite given up hope of matrimony altogether?" Caroline's fingers had tightened on her reticule, her heart pounding. Where was Alexander? They had planned this so carefully. He was supposed to be here. "Lady Constance," Caroline had said quietly, fighting to keep her voice from shaking, "my personal affairs are hardly appropriate discussion." "Oh, but Caroline," Lady Victoria had interjected, "we only worry for you. At your age, without prospects, without fortune, what will become of you?" "She shall become what all unmarriageable women become," another voice had added, Lady Dorothea Fairfax, known throughout London for her cutting wit. "A burden upon her family, a cautionary tale, a warning to young girls about the dangers of being too particular." The laughter had been refined, subtle, absolutely devastating. Caroline had felt tears burning behind her eyes. This was worse than she had imagined. The humiliation was public, calculated, designed to destroy what little dignity she had left. "At 30, Constance had said, her voice now pitched to carry to every corner of the ballroom, "with no fortune, no prospects, and no particular beauty or accomplishment to recommend her, Lady Caroline Ashworth represents everything a young woman should fear becoming. She is, quite simply, excuse me," the voice had cut through the crowd like a blade, deep, cold, absolutely furious. "I believe," the voice had continued, each word clipped with barely controlled rage, "you are addressing my wife." The silence that had descended was total, absolute, suffocating. Every head in the ballroom had turned. And there, standing in the doorway like a judgment incarnate, was Alexander Blackwood, the Duke of Ravensmere. His pale grey eyes had been fixed on Lady Constance with an expression of such withering contempt that the woman had visibly paled. Your wife?" Constance had stammered, all her cruel confidence evaporating. Alexander had crossed the ballroom with measured strides, the crowd parting before him like water before the prow of a ship. He had not stopped until he stood directly before Caroline, his broad frame a shield between her and her tormentors. "My wife," Alexander had repeated, his voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom. "Lady Caroline Blackwood, Duchess of Ravensmere. We married 6 months ago." The silence following Alexander's announcement was so complete that Caroline could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. The Duke of Ravensmere, married, to her. She watched the information ripple through the crowd, shock, disbelief, a desperate scrambling to reconcile what they had just heard with everything they thought they knew. Lady Constance looked as though she might faint. Her face had gone from flushed to ashen in the space of a heartbeat, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. "That's impossible," Lady Victoria had finally managed, her voice strangled. "The Duke would never. She is my wife," Alexander had interrupted, his tone brook no argument. "The Duchess of Ravensmere, and you, Lady Constance, Lady Victoria, and every person in this room who has taken it upon themselves to mock her, to diminish her, to suggest she is somehow unworthy or unmarriageable." He had paused, his pale grey eyes sweeping the assembled crowd with glacial disdain. "You are all owed a lesson in basic human decency." Alexander had turned then, his hand extended to Caroline. "My love," he had said, his voice softening impossibly. "Come here." Caroline had stepped forward on trembling legs, placing her hand in his. The familiar warmth of his touch had anchored her, steadied her racing heart. Alexander had raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her gloved knuckles while maintaining eye contact, an unmistakably intimate gesture that sent a collective gasp through the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander had said, turning to address the ballroom while keeping Caroline's hand firmly clasped in his, "allow me to properly introduce my Duchess. We married quietly 6 months ago, preferring privacy to spectacle, but tonight I wish to correct any misapprehensions about my wife's position in society." His voice had taken on an edge of steel. "Lady Caroline Blackwood is now one of the highest-ranking women in England. She outranks every person in this room to save royalty. More importantly, she is intelligent, compassionate, honest, and possesses more integrity in her smallest finger than most of you demonstrate in your entire lives. Caroline had felt tears prick her eyes, but these were not tears of shame. These were tears of vindication, of relief, of overwhelming love for this man who was defending her with such fierce pride. Your Grace, Lady Constance, had finally found her voice, though it trembled badly. I had no idea, that is, had I known. Had you known I was married to her, Alexander had interrupted coldly, you would have behaved differently, which reveals precisely the sort of person you are. Lady Constance, you showed cruelty to someone you perceived as vulnerable and powerless. Now that you know she has my protection, my title, my complete devotion, suddenly you wish to apologize. Constance had paled further, recognizing the trap. I merely meant, I know exactly what you meant. Alexander had cut her off. You meant to humiliate a woman you viewed as beneath you. You meant to exercise the petty power that comes from social standing. You meant to be cruel because you could. He had stepped closer to Constance, towering over her. Let me be absolutely clear, Lady Constance. You will never speak to my wife in such a manner again. You will never speak about my wife in such a manner again. In fact, you will be fortunate if I allow you to remain in any social circle where my Duchess is present. Your Grace, please. Constance's voice cracked. Furthermore, Alexander had continued relentlessly, I want everyone in this ballroom to understand something. My wife was 30 years old when we married. She had been deemed unmarriageable by your standards. She possessed no significant fortune. By society's cruel and arbitrary measures, she was invisible, unwanted, expendable. His arm had wrapped around Caroline's waist, pulling her close. And I chose her, not in spite of these things, but because she is extraordinary, because she is intelligent enough to debate philosophy and practical enough to discuss crop rotation, because she reads Gothic novels and makes me laugh, because she is kind without being weak, honest without being cruel, and more valuable than every titled beauty who has ever been paraded before me, hoping to secure my fortune. Caroline had pressed her face against his shoulder, overwhelmed by the public declaration of everything she had secretly craved to hear. You married her 6 months ago? Lady Victoria had asked weakly, clearly still struggling to process. But you've been seen together only recently. We maintained privacy during the first months of our marriage, Alexander had replied. My wife needed time to learn her duties without society's interference. I needed time too. He had paused, looking down at Caroline with an expression of such open tenderness that several ladies in the crowd had gasped. I needed time to fall in love with her, Alexander had admitted quietly. Though in truth, I believe I fell in love with her the moment she collided with me in a bookshop, dropped her novels everywhere, and looked at me as though I was simply a clumsy man rather than a title to be pursued. A bookshop, someone had whispered, the story already beginning to spread. This is unorthodox, Lord Pemberton had ventured, stepping forward. He was Constance's father, a man of considerable political influence. Your Grace, surely you can understand society's confusion. To marry so secretly, someone of such modest circumstances. Alexander's expression had turned dangerous. Lord Pemberton, I understand that you hope to see your daughter become Duchess of Ravensmere. I understand that my mother encouraged those hopes. I am here to inform you and everyone else that such hopes were always futile. His arm had tightened around Caroline. I would never have married your daughter, Lord Pemberton. Her cruelty tonight has only confirmed the wisdom of that decision. My wife, however my brilliant, kind, extraordinary wife, is everything a duchess should be. But the circumstances, Lord Pemberton had begun, the circumstances, Alexander had interrupted sharply, are that I am the Duke of Ravensmere. I am one of the wealthiest men in England. I hold significant political influence. I answer to no one regarding my choice of wife. And I have chosen Caroline. The ballroom had remained frozen, everyone struggling to adapt to this sudden shift in social dynamics. Then, from the back of the crowd, a new voice had spoken. Well said, Ravensmere. The crowd had parted to reveal Lord Ashford, Caroline's father, moving forward with his wife on his arm. Both were smiling. Papa, Caroline had breathed. My dear daughter, Lord Ashford had said, reaching them and taking Caroline's free hand. I have watched you endure 6 months of maintaining this secret. It has been difficult, I know, But tonight, seeing how your husband defends you, how he loves you, the Earl's voice had grown thick with emotion. Tonight I am proud, not because you married a duke, but because you married a good man who sees your true value. Lady Ashford had embraced Caroline, tears streaming down her face. We knew, she had whispered. Of course we knew about the marriage. We have been dying to tell everyone, to see their faces when they learn. A ripple of laughter had moved through the crowd, the tension finally breaking. The entire town has been mocking my daughter for being unmarriageable, Lord Ashford had announced, his voice carrying, while she was secretly the Duchess of Ravensmere. I confess, I have enjoyed the irony immensely. More laughter, this time genuinely amused. And now, Alexander had said, his tone warming slightly, I would like to dance with my wife. Our first dance as a publicly acknowledged married couple. I believe a waltz would be appropriate. He had looked down at Caroline, his pale eyes soft. May I have this dance, Duchess? Caroline nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. The orchestra, clearly delighted by the drama, had immediately struck up a waltz. As Alexander had led Caroline onto the floor, the crowd had parted, everyone's eyes fixed on them with a mixture of shock, envy, and grudging admiration. I'm sorry I was delayed, Alexander had murmured as they began to move together. Lord Thornfield cornered me with some political matter. When I finally extracted myself and heard what was happening, you were perfect, Caroline had interrupted, looking up at him with shining eyes. Alexander, what you said, I meant every word, Alexander had replied firmly. Every single word, Caroline. You are extraordinary. You are my wife, and I will never allow anyone to make you feel less than you are. They had moved together across the floor, and gradually, other couples had joined them, society's acceptance manifesting in this simple act of dancing at the Duke and Duchess of Ravensmere's first public appearance. As the waltz had continued, Alexander had pulled Caroline closer than was strictly proper, his lips brushing her ear. I love you, he had whispered. I love you so desperately that these past 6 months of secrecy have been torture. I wanted to shout from every rooftop that you are mine. I wanted to destroy anyone who looked at you with pity or disdain. You did destroy them, Caroline had replied, a slightly giddy laugh escaping. Did you see Lady Constance's face? I believe she may never recover. Good, Alexander had said with satisfaction. She deserves to suffer for her cruelty, as do all of them. The waltz had ended, but Alexander had not immediately released her. Instead, he had kept one arm around her waist, his other hand still clasping hers, as they faced the assembled crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, he had announced, my Duchess and I will be hosting a New Year's ball at Ravensmere Abbey. We hope you will attend to celebrate the beginning of our public life together. It was both an invitation and a command. Those who wished to remain in the Duke of Ravensmere's good graces would attend and treat his Duchess with appropriate respect. And now, Alexander had continued, if you will excuse us, I wish to steal my wife away for some privacy. 6 months of secrecy have taught me to value our moments alone. He had guided Caroline from the ballroom, ignoring the whispers and stares, his hand steady and warm in the small of her back. They had slipped into a quiet conservatory, the door closing behind them with a soft click. That was, Caroline had begun, then laughed helplessly. That was the most extraordinary thing I have ever witnessed. You should have seen your face when I announced you were my wife, Alexander had replied, pulling her into his arms. Such shock. Did you truly think I would allow them to continue tormenting you? I didn't know where you were, Caroline had admitted. I thought perhaps you had changed your mind about the public announcement. Never, Alexander had interrupted fiercely. Caroline, I would burn down that entire ballroom before I would allow anyone to humiliate you. You are mine, my wife, my Duchess, my love, and I will spend the rest of my life ensuring you never doubt your value again. He had kissed her then, deep and passionate, pouring 6 months of hidden love into that single embrace. When they had finally parted, both breathless, Caroline had smiled through her tears. So much for our quiet, practical arrangement, she had said. Who needs practicality? Alexander had replied. When we have this, and, in the warm glow of the conservatory, surrounded by winter blooms and the distant sound of music, the Duke and Duchess of Ravensmere had held each other close, knowing that they had faced society's worst cruelty and emerged not just unscathed, but victorious. The gossip, predictably, had been intense. For weeks following the Thornfield Christmas ball, London society had discussed nothing but the Duke of Ravensmere's shocking secret marriage. Did you hear? He married her 6 months ago. Poor Lady Constance. She must be absolutely mortified. They say he fell in love with her in a bookshop. A bookshop? She's 30 years old. Everyone thought she was unmarried. Well, she showed us all, didn't she? She's a duchess now. Some of the gossip had been catty, some envious, but most had been tinged with grudging admiration. The ton loved nothing more than a dramatic romance, and the story of the reclusive duke who had married an overlooked spinster in secret was irresistible. Lady Constance Pemberton had left London immediately, claiming ill health. She had been notably absent from society events for the remainder of the season. Lady Victoria Hastings had attempted to curry favour with the new Duchess, but Caroline, now confident in her position, had declined the overtures with polite but unmistakable coldness. "I have no interest in friendships born of expedience," Caroline had told Alexander. "Those who valued me before they knew my title are welcome. The others may keep their distance." The New Year's ball at Ravensmere Abbey had been a triumph. Hundreds of guests had attended, eager to see the Duke and Duchess in their natural environment. They had found a couple so obviously devoted to one another that any lingering doubts about the marriage's authenticity had evaporated. Alexander had danced with Caroline repeatedly, unconcerned with propriety. He had introduced her to political allies with evident pride. He had kept his hand on her waist possessively whenever other gentlemen approached. And Caroline had blossomed in her role, managing the complex social event with grace and efficiency, charming guests with her intelligence and wit, and generally proving that she was, indeed, everything a duchess should be. "They are besotted," the Duchess of Devonshire had observed to Lady Ashford. "I have never seen Ravensmere so human. Your daughter has worked a miracle." "My daughter," Lady Ashford had replied with satisfaction, "has always been extraordinary. It simply took the right man to recognize it." 1 year after the Christmas ball, Caroline sat in the morning room at Ravensmere Abbey, sunshine streaming through the windows as she reviewed correspondence. She heard Alexander's footsteps before she saw him. She always did. After 18 months of marriage, she knew every sound he made, every shift of mood, every unspoken thought. "Good morning, Duchess," Alexander had said, entering and immediately moving to kiss her. "Good morning, Duke," Caroline had replied, smiling against his lips. "You're in a good mood." "I am always in a good mood when I wake beside my wife," Alexander had countered, settling into the chair beside her. "What are you reading?" "An invitation from Lady Constance Pemberton," Caroline had said, holding up the gilt-edged card. "She is hosting a spring ball and wishes us to attend." Alexander's expression had darkened. "Absolutely not. After what she—" "Alexander," Caroline had interrupted gently, placing her hand over his. "It has been a year. She has been appropriately chastened. And," Caroline had smiled slightly, "I believe I would enjoy attending, not for her sake, but for mine." "You want to return to the scene of her cruelty?" Alexander had asked, confused. "I want to return as your wife," Caroline had corrected. "As a duchess, as a woman who has spent a year proving that society's judgment of me was worthless. I want to walk into that ballroom on your arm and show everyone, including myself, how far I have come." Understanding had dawned in Alexander's pale eyes. "You want to reclaim that space," he had said softly. "To transform the memory of humiliation into one of triumph." "Precisely," Caroline had agreed. "Then we shall attend," Alexander had decided, "and I shall ensure Lady Constance understands exactly how fortunate she is that my wife has chosen to forgive her." The spring ball had been everything Caroline had hoped. She had entered on Alexander's arm, wearing a gown of pale gold that made her auburn hair gleam like fire. The sapphires Alexander had given her for their first anniversary had glittered at her throat and ears. Lady Constance had greeted them with appropriate deference, her curtsy deep and her voice carefully neutral. "Your Graces, thank you for attending." "Lady Constance," Caroline had replied with genuine graciousness. "What a lovely ball. The decorations are beautiful." Constance's eyes had filled with unexpected tears. "Your Grace, I must tell you I have spent this past year deeply ashamed of my behavior. What I said to you, how I treated you, it was unconscionable. I do not expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that I am truly, profoundly sorry." Caroline had studied the other woman for a long moment. Constance looked different, less polished, less confident, more human. "I accept your apology," Caroline had said quietly. "We all make mistakes, Lady Constance. The measure of character is whether we learn from them." Relief had flooded Constance's features. "You are generous, Your Grace. Far more generous than I deserve." As the evening had progressed, Caroline had found herself surrounded by ladies seeking her conversation, her opinion, her attention. The same women who had ignored her a year ago now vied for her favor. It should have been satisfying. Instead, Caroline had found herself seeking Alexander, needing the grounding presence of someone who had valued her before she was a duchess. She had found him on the terrace, looking out over the moonlit gardens. "Escaping?" she had asked, slipping her arm through his. "Seeking you," Alexander had corrected, pulling her close. "I find balls tedious unless you are beside me." "We used to both hate these events," Caroline had observed. "Now you attend them without complaint, because you are there," Alexander had said simply. "Anywhere you are is where I wish to be." Caroline had rested her head against his shoulder, breathing in his familiar scent. "Do you remember," she had asked softly, "when you proposed our arrangement? You said you could never offer me romantic love." "I was an idiot," Alexander had replied immediately. "I was terrified and wounded and convinced I had nothing left to give. You proved me wrong in every possible way." "We proved each other wrong," Caroline had corrected. "I thought I was unmarriageable. You thought you were incapable of love. We were both mistaken." Alexander had turned her in his arms, his pale grey eyes luminous in the moonlight. "Caroline Blackwood," he had said, "you are the greatest surprise of my life, the most precious gift I never knew I needed. I love you more today than I did yesterday, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today, every single day for the rest of my life." "That is quite romantic for a man who claimed he couldn't do romance," Caroline had teased, even as tears sparkled in her eyes. "You've corrupted me," Alexander had replied with a slight smile. "Made me soft. It made me happy. Made me believe in things I thought I'd lost forever. Such as hope," Alexander had said quietly. "Joy. The possibility that wounds can heal and trust can be rebuilt. The knowledge that loving someone doesn't have to end in betrayal, it can end in this, in partnership, in laughter, in waking every morning beside the person who sees every flaw and loves me anyway." Caroline had kissed him then, pouring everything she felt into that single gesture. When they had parted, she had whispered against his lips, "Take me home, Alexander. I have had quite enough of society for one evening." "With pleasure, my love," Alexander had replied. They had departed the ball early, much to the disappointment of those seeking the Duchess's attention, and had returned to Ravensmere Abbey in comfortable silence. Later that night, as they lay tangled together in the massive ducal bed, Alexander had traced idle patterns on Caroline's bare shoulder. "I have been thinking," he said quietly. "Dangerous," Caroline had teased. "We should have a child," Alexander had continued, his voice turning serious. "An heir, yes, but more than that, a family. I want to fill this house with children and laughter and all the warmth it has lacked for so long." Caroline had turned to face him, her hand cupping his cheek. "Are you certain? After Lady Margaret?" "Lady Margaret was 8 years ago," Alexander had interrupted. "You are now. Our future is now. And I want that future to include children who inherit your intelligence and kindness and, God willing, my stubbornness. Your children will be impossibly spoiled," Caroline had warned. "You'll be that father who can deny them nothing." "Probably," Alexander had agreed, grinning. "But you'll be the sensible one who keeps us all grounded." "Then yes," Caroline had said softly. "Let us have a family, Alexander. Let us fill this house with love." 18 months later, the Ravensmere Abbey nursery was filled with afternoon sunlight and the sounds of a baby's delighted laughter. Thomas Alexander Blackwood, heir to the Duchy of Ravensmere, was 7 months old, with his mother's auburn hair and his father's pale grey eyes. He was currently attempting to grab his father's watch chain while Alexander held him up, making faces that sent the baby into peals of giggles. "You are ridiculous with him," Caroline observed from the doorway, her heart swelling with love at the sight. "I am an excellent father," Alexander corrected, not looking away from his son. "Aren't I, Thomas? Tell your mother how excellent I am." Thomas responded by grabbing Alexander's nose and squealing. "See," Alexander said triumphantly. "He agrees." Caroline crossed the room, settling beside her husband and son On the nursery floor, propriety be damned. Do you remember, she said, watching Thomas attempt to eat Alexander's cravat, when you proposed a practical arrangement, a marriage of convenience with no emotional attachment? Vaguely, Alexander replied, finally looking at her with such open adoration that Caroline's breath caught. It seems like another lifetime, another version of myself. We were both so certain we knew what we wanted, Caroline mused. Security and respect for me, freedom from emotional risk for you. We thought we could maintain a careful distance. We were fools, Alexander said. Beautiful, wounded fools who didn't realize we were exactly what each other needed. Thomas, bored with the watch chain, had reached for his mother. Caroline had gathered him close, breathing in that particular scent of baby milk and powder and pure innocence. I am grateful, she said quietly, for Lady Constance's cruelty. Alexander's eyebrows had risen. That seems uncharacteristically forgiving. I mean it, Caroline insisted. If she hadn't humiliated me so publicly, you wouldn't have claimed me so dramatically. If you hadn't claimed me, I might never have known how deeply you loved me. Her cruelty forced you to tear down every wall you'd built, to declare your feelings before all of society. I would have told you eventually, Alexander protested. Would you? Caroline challenged gently. Or would you have continued maintaining careful emotional distance out of fear? Sometimes, my love, we need to be pushed into admitting what terrifies us most. Alexander had been quiet for a long moment, one hand absently stroking Thomas's back. You're right, he finally admitted. I was still holding back, still protecting myself from potential loss. Constance's attack forced me to choose let you suffer alone or claim you publicly and risk everything I'd been guarding against. And you chose me, Caroline said softly. I will always choose you, Alexander replied. You and Thomas and whatever other children we have. You are my family, Caroline, my home, my everything. As if on cue, Thomas had yawned enormously and snuggled against Caroline's chest, clearly ready for his afternoon nap. I'll take him, Alexander had said, carefully lifting their son. You've been with him all morning. Rest for a bit. Caroline had watched her husband carry their child to the cradle, crooning softly the feared Duke of Ravensmere reduced to singing lullabies. When Thomas was settled, Alexander had returned to Caroline, pulling her to her feet and into his arms. Thank you, he had murmured against her hair. For what? For being impertinent in a bookshop, Alexander had said, his voice warm with humor and love. For agreeing to marry a difficult duke who thought he wanted convenience. For teaching me that loving someone doesn't mean losing yourself. For giving me Thomas. For giving me this a life I never imagined I could have. You gave me all of that too, Caroline had replied, her arms tightening around him. You saw value in me when I had stopped seeing it in myself. You loved me when I thought I was unlovable. You transformed my humiliation into triumph. We transformed each other, Alexander had corrected, echoing words they had spoken before. And there, in the sunlit nursery, with their son sleeping peacefully nearby, the Duke and Duchess of Ravensmere had held each other close, two people who had started with a practical arrangement and discovered something infinitely more valuable. They had discovered that the deepest love often grows in the most unexpected places, that the greatest partnerships are built on honesty rather than romance, that being seen, truly seen, is worth more than any title or fortune, and that sometimes the person society deems unmarriageable is exactly the person who will teach you what marriage truly means.